Welcome, everybody, to the 16th episode of the Paleoconnection. I am Brandon, joined again by Verv, and today we are going to do another sort of news rundown. We got a lot of things on tap, some election stuff, some things about the recent protests that have gone on in Washington, D.C., as well as COVID, and maybe some feel-good stories at the end. We're going to get started first with some new COVID numbers. So those of you who have been paying attention to the news recently, to American news, you would know that America has recently seen a very large increase in both daily cases and hospitalizations. The specific numbers, this is from the Friday the 13th, November 13th, stats. This is currently hospitalized 68,516. Daily cases, there was 170,333 cases. And there was also over 1.6 million tests just on that day alone. So the numbers are rising. However, the daily deaths do seem to be steadily decreasing. The number from November 13th was 1,301 deaths. So we have single day records for those daily cases and hospitalizations and tests. This has, I'd say, changed the mood in many of the states around the U.S. For example, the state that I'm in, the state that I'm from, Illinois, Maryland, and Washington, said that they have not ruled out ramping up restrictions or enforcement, even if that means forcing businesses to close to reduce the spread of the virus. This is something that would be highly controversial, right? Forcing businesses to close down completely. A lot of people would see this as a breach of government power, certainly. Also, we are seeing a change in the sporting world, specifically in college sports. For example, the Ivy League is the first Division I college athletics conference to cancel its winter sports season. I think there is a lot of high hopes. College football is currently going on in the U.S., so is professional football. There's a lot of hopes that they would just sort of get through the seasons and sort of deal with COVID, but it seems as if the push these days is to completely cancel seasons. Another point that is of note is that Joe Biden, who might possibly be going into the White House very soon, is in favor of a national mask mandate. This is something that I can see causing mass protests around the U.S. So the numbers are increasing with COVID, and things do not seem to be getting better. What do you think about this, Verv?
Because the daily deaths have generally improved significantly from the very start of it, I do have some hope. And it's also really amazing to see that the testing capacity that the United States has is around, 1.5 million on a daily basis, which is truly a tremendous number. So, I mean, there's some positive things to consider here. But, overall, it is a very alarming epidemic because, one of the first things that comes into your mind is that maybe we're going to have some mutations, right? We heard about the mutations that were happening in Denmark. And while those don't necessarily prove to be more fatal, it was a situation where the new strains could be more resistant to treatment by drugs. So overall, we do have to be very concerned about whether or not the ever-increasing number will come to lead to more strains that could make the whole thing a lot worse, even though we have become a lot better at treating it.
Yes, we should also mention, too, the big news coming from the pharmaceutical company Pfizer, that they do have a COVID vaccine coming down the pipes. Supposedly, I've heard numbers like it's 90% effective. There's also been a lot of questioning about the timing of that announcement as well. I know some people believe that it was politically motivated. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's likely that it was to some degree politically motivated, because initially the bar was set at something like 30 or 32 cases to have it tested on. And then when that was met sometime in October, the number was pushed back up to 60-something. And it seems likely that they didn't imagine that they would get the 30 or so cases that quickly, and that because of sort of a political motivation, they would push the number back up to do it in November. Now, whether that's because they would like to remain apolitical, which is I'm sure how they'd like to explain it, or whether it is because of a sort of anti-Trump sentiment, we'll never really be sure of that. These are the sort of things where the exact logic of it is not going to be written down somewhere for everyone to look up. But knowing what I know about Germany and what Germans have told me about the German media, the media there is very squarely against Trump. And there's sort of this attitude that, you can always be dismissing him. He's almost so looked down upon by German media. You don't even really think of him as a representative of, say, American conservatives so much as, he's this monster that shouldn't really be associated with conservatism at all. He's really kind of this publicly agreed upon enemy. So the idea to me that a German company, well, two German companies, because BioNTech is also German, would make a decision that they knew would hurt Trump, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I wouldn't be surprised if even conservatives at that company would not even consider it biased against conservatives in general, but just a proper stance against Trump.
Yes, that's right. One thing that we always have to remember, kind of put things in perspective, is that COVID is something affecting the entire world. This is not just an American problem, even though it seems like media constantly, pays attention to the difficulties that are happening in America. There's huge difficulties happening in Europe, in third world countries, and other places around the world. And I just wanted to talk about that just a bit. Now, you mentioned Germany, and there is a huge movement going on right now in Germany, in large, violent protests that have started against government restrictions. I just want to read one quote here from BloombergQuint.com. It says, "A growing violent undercurrent at large-scale street demonstrations against coronavirus restrictions, including one attended by 20,000 people Saturday," this is this past Saturday, in Leipzig. "The developments point to an increasingly radicalized movement of virus skeptics in Germany." Now, this is the part that I'm a bit skeptical about here, that is added into the article. It says, "Embraced by the country's far-right extremist groups and energized by global conspiracy theories, notably those put forth by the U.S.-born QAnon movement." So I see some good reporting here. They're reporting protests, and then I see them trying to connect it directly to what they might perceive as the alt-right. But nonetheless, there are large-scale demonstrations, not just in Germany, but going on throughout Europe, where people are very afraid about some of these coronavirus restrictions, and they feel like their freedoms are being taken away too much. Thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think it's actually very natural for people to be going out and protesting, and it's just this kind of terrible reaction that the governments have to try to blame it on some group, some boogeyman. In this case, of course, the go-to is always the far right. To be completely fair, it does tend to be the far right and the QAnon type people who do have coronavirus skepticism. But there still are plenty on the left that don't. I just think it's such an issue where the Greens and some of the further to the left groups that you see in any country, whether it's Germany or the US, they are partly enfranchised in the power structure, literally sometimes in the national government, often in the national government. And of course, they are very firmly entrenched in academia and journalism. So I think it's very natural that these very understandable protests, which are going to have some of the far right elements, are always going to be blamed squarely upon the far right, QAnon, etc. Because it's such an easy way for the government and the media that gets the government elected and supports the government to just weasel out of any kind of actual accountability.
Yeah, it's a way to sort of delegitimize the protests. And
Exactly.
the funny thing is, yes, perhaps many of the protests in wealthier Western countries are more right wing, but if you go to other countries around the world, for example, in India, in other third world countries, there's different kind of protests. So, for example, another quote from the same article, it says a third type of protest is more common in poor countries. It mobilizes people not so much because they worry about the virus or democracy, but because they fear for their livelihood. For example, in Malawi, which is, of course, a country in Africa, street vendors have marched with signs saying, "We'd rather die of corona than of hunger." The citizens of Ecuador have rioted against coronavirus policies that threaten to impoverish them, including the shutdown of state-owned companies and salary cuts. So, yes, perhaps we can characterize the protests in the West in a certain perspective as right-wing, but yeah, other countries around the world, this is literally, poor people who they're living, if they don't get work that day, they don't make enough money to feed themselves. So, they would die of hunger literally instead of dying of COVID. Usually these are younger people as well that they are not high risk COVID fatalities anyways. So that's what the kind of protests are like in the third world.
That's exactly right. And when we spoke with the libertarian Indian gentleman, AJ, he touched on that vaguely. And it's really been this theme that everyone's really uncomfortable about because it brings up really a very legitimate criticism. It goes back to like the whole Les Miserables thing where you got the guy who steals to feed his family. Now, what about the people who are going out and working in violation of the restrictions that they put in place to feed their family? It's really, they have a choice between starving to death or dying potentially of COVID. And much of the time, a lot of these workers who are still in that condition, they are in their 20s or 30s. They're not in a high risk group. And they're also the breadwinners for people who, are children. It's really a no-brainer. These people do have to work, and shutting down the entire economy is kind of foolish. Another thing I'd like to bring up on that is when you do look at countries like Nigeria and many of the places in Africa, the age distribution is much different than you see in like Japan, USA, Korea, France, where we kind of have like this inverse pyramid where the older the age group is, the more people there are. But if you go to places like the Central African Republic, like half the country is under the age of 25, right? So they have a very different set of risks when it comes to the coronavirus and probably could have a much more open economy. But it's a shame that they've just been told by the different world health leaders that they need to imitate the British or Italian model of dealing with the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Sort of close the book on this. Just one final quote, that Bloomberg coined article. It says, this is the author of the article speaking. It says, in April, I predicted that this pandemic social revolutions, but we've seen so far is only the start. Despite new hopes of vaccine, COVID now enter its deadliest phase in many regions. And winter. After we defeat the virus, many of its effects will linger for years. And I certainly believe this is true. We're going to see governments fall. We're going to see massive changes, in the work environment, in societies and governments. So this is really just the beginning of probably a global revolution. I'm not yet sure if it's going to be for good or it's going to be for.
That kind of reminds me of how people have tossed out this idea of maybe taxing you when you work from home. So even if we do have these tremendous social revolutions, the only thing really for sure is death and taxes, and they will find a way to stick that tax knife into you no matter what you're doing.
That's exactly right. Paying more taxes for working at home. It's sort of like, I remember when a lot of government agencies first started going on the internet and providing services. Not sure how common it is anymore, but it was common a while back that they would charge a service fee for doing your business online, which seems absurd, right? Because you're actually saving them time and money you would think, by doing something online instead of going in person and having to interact with an employee that needs to be paid money and so on and so forth. It's sort of that, from that sort of same sort of ridiculous, reverse, of what you think would be the correct way of doing things. But, paying more taxes for staying at home, maybe the future, guys.
And that is exactly right. So let's now shift gears and we will talk a bit more about the ongoing election saga in the United States. So just recently, in order to show support for President Trump as the battle for the White House rages on, significantly large groups of people have been heading out to march in protest, which now included the quite famous Groypers, led by Nick Fuentes. Big League Politics describes Fuentes as a paleoconservative, a political position that is very much ignored and has been ignored for decades by the mainstream. Probably the biggest name in that movement that is very recognizable is Pat Buchanan. So paleoconservatives basically are those who believe in the Christian heritage of Americans being directly relevant to all of the local politics that they do, and that ethics needs to be more prominent in how we govern. They also emphasize that the nation and even the region should play a far more prominent role in politics, especially above multinational corporations and sort of this globalistic vision that people have, where if it's not the multinational corporations forcing out some global trade, some global regulations for thinking about everyone, it's going to be sort of the soft globalism, we are a one giant village mentality that you get from the left. So as these groups marched through places like Lansing, they shouted things like Fox News sucks. This is something that really is a surprising development. If you would have told me that a month ago that we would have groups of people marching around in support of Trump yelling about how Fox News sucks, it would be really surprising to me. The same thing was actually repeated in Washington, D.C. within the last 24 hours. It would have been Saturday in the U.S., where they were having the Million Mega March. A video produced by a Huffington Post journalist and was posted on YouTube that garnered over 2 million views already, had the same Fox News sucks chant. Something quite interesting as well is that President Donald Trump did not let Fox News escape his vision at all. Earlier today, he sent out a tweet directed at Fox News saying, Fox News and the fake news network aren't showing these massive gatherings. Instead, they have the reporters standing in almost empty streets. We now have suppression by the press. Mega. So this follows on him just 2-3 days ago tweeting multiple times about how he's going to be looking at Newsmax and OAN, and how he's encouraging all of his followers to do the same. So my big question for you, Brandon, did you anticipate this big turn on Fox News? And, what do you think about it?
No, like you said, how could someone anticipate such a thing? Of course, Fox News has been sort of the only major news outlet, I guess, if you want to consider Fox News mainstream media, that sort of support. So Trump supporters turning on Fox News is a real change of events. So that could not be expected. I can understand why they are. The recent election, and seems as if Fox News has sort of thrown their cards in with the rest of the media, whereas Trump, I think, was hoping that Fox News would back him and back his lawsuits and his attempt to try to show that there was fraud in the election. So yeah, as you said, nobody could expect this. One thing that I thought was really interesting, speaking about these protests in this Million MAGA march in Washington D.C., I thought Trump's tweet about Antifa was quite based. I'll quote it here. He says, "Radical left Antifa scum was easily rebuffed today by the big DC MAGA rally crowd, only to return at night after 99% of the crowd had left to assault elderly people and families. Police got there, but late. Mayor is not doing her job." And those of you who've been paying attention to this will know that there were violent protests. I don't know all the details about it, but I do know some Trump supporters have been severely injured, and there was counter protests going on by Antifa and BLM and their supporters. One thing I will say about this is it's quite interesting how when, let's say, a right-wing group, let's even say a far right-wing group, goes out to protest, it always seems like there is violence against them by the left, whereas we had months of consecutive protests going on in many cities across the nation. Everybody knows about Portland. Everybody knows about the Chaz experiment that happened in Seattle, where these radical left-wing groups took over an entire portion of Seattle. And you didn't see right-wing counter-protesters, just going at it with them. You saw these protests go on for months, and they were allowed by the local authorities, by the local police. They were assaulting a federal courthouse in Portland, and they were still allowed to do it. But the right wing decides to lead a march in Washington D.C., and of course, violence breaks out again, caused by Antifa and their supporters. What do you think about this violence?
It's really to be expected. We even were talking about how it's not a matter of if, but of how much, and that's really where America has been, not just since George Floyd, but since Trump even began his campaign for the presidency. One of the only potential benefits of President Trump not being in office is that he still is a very influential voice for his supporters and would probably be a very effective campaigner. We might even see President Trump, if he's out of office, take a more direct confrontational stance with Antifa. Of course, they say that, presidents tend to permanently leave the public light when they end their presidency, and that has more or less been true. You could point out, though, that President Obama has directed political in nature TV shows for Netflix, but it's also very true we've entered a very different era of politics, and President Trump is not your typical president by any stretch of the mind. So I could potentially see him battling with Antifa into the future, either as president or as not president. But, the one criticism is he said 4 years to do it, and it's been a little bit lackluster overall.
Yes, that's exactly right. If Trump does end up leaving office, I don't think he's going to sit quietly by the side. He's going to, I'm not sure exactly what he's going to do, but he's going to do something. He has this huge base, right? He has all of these supporters, and you'd think he'd be nuts not to, come up with some sort of plan to, mobilize them together. Speaking
Exactly.
about Obama, as you were saying, that he has sort of, for the most part, been on the sidelines, but recently he has criticized Trump quite a lot, and I believe he was criticizing Trump quite a bit while he was campaigning for Biden. I think he said something about Trump cares about only feeding his ego and that sort of thing. The kind of stuff that ex-presidents, normally would not say about current sitting presidents. So I think Obama has recently, I think he kind of put his finger in the air and decided, I think now is about time to start offering my opinion about Trump, because the public perception of Trump, at least, if you listen to the media, is so low that I think Obama felt like now is the time to sort of, pile on to Trump. And he has been doing it recently, much more than he did the first 3 years.
Which is honestly disappointing for people who, wish that ex-presidents would stay out of the public political sphere. But, hey, we are in that zone now where that is more or less normal. So going a little bit back to the election stuff and pushing forward, one of the things that President Trump has also been criticizing is the recount process itself, actively saying on his Twitter that an actual auditing of the ballots is needed. He said, "The hand recount taking place in Georgia is a waste of time. They are not showing the matching signatures. Call off the recount until they allow the match. Don't let the radical left Dems steal the election." And a very similar sentiment was reported today from a very relevant figure in Breitbart, the former Michigan Secretary of State Ruth Johnson told the Kyle Olson Show that an independent audit is needed of the ballots cast during the presidential election. The article goes on to observe that recounting's not going to help us because the allegations we've received that are credible have examples of things that aren't going to be found in a recount, she said, including the coaching of voters, making it difficult for observers to watch the process and counting ballots multiple times. These are all against the law, and these are integrity processes that need to be adhered to, Johnson said. So basically, if they've snuck in ballots the first time that weren't appropriate, they'll just be counting those again. Moreover, we go back to the issue of signatures and matching signatures, and how these absentee ballots themselves can really be a situation where they're ripe for fraud. I had actually heard that there is, in one of the affidavits that's been filed, someone in a county in Michigan has said that 60% of the signatures on absentee ballots were basically identical. Another interesting thing, which Charlie Kirk pointed out in a tweet, is that the rejection for mail-in ballots is 30 times lower than the historical average in Pennsylvania. Just 951 mail-in ballots out of 2.6 million cast were rejected. He asked if they're even checking the ballots or not. So overall, a very good question, especially considering that this absentee ballot system is really something that's traditionally been used to stuff the ballot box. And when you've got observers who are 60 feet away what are they actually doing? So do you have any thoughts more on the fraud that may be going on in this election?
Yeah, I'd actually like to bring up another thing that I heard about recently. I was watching a clip, a Lou Dobbs clip. I'm not sure if you've seen this clip or you've heard about this, but he had a retired general on there, and he was talking about how the CIA has two election interfering programs they're called the Hammer and Scorecard. These are two CIA programs designed by the CIA to interfere in foreign elections, and they've had these programs for quite some time now. And this general was saying that he thinks that this was used in the U.S. in this election. He says that he thinks it was privatized by deep state players from the Obama administration. It's quite an interesting interview. I would encourage everybody to watch it. But
that does sound amazing.
It brings up a very interesting slant to this, which is something I don't think is surprising to any of us, that the CIA would have a vote interfering program. You know, obviously all we hear about is Russia and China, but obviously the U.S. and the CIA, one of the preeminent, probably not the preeminent spy agency in the world with the biggest budget, the greatest technology. Why would they also not have a foreign election interference program? And would they use that domestically? And the question, or the answer to that question, might be yes. What do you think about that, Verv?
I'm not surprised at all that such techniques have been developed. And we are talking about a president who is probably the least popular ever amongst what we would call the deep state. It would not be surprising if people did pull out all the stops and did go for employing very questionable means to get what they want done. We saw what happened in the first 2 to 3 years of President Trump's presidency, where right away they were out for blood, trying to get him impeached. Many people have described this as being a sort of soft coup. If we are looking at people in the FBI and who are part of the Democrat operation in Washington, really trying to get together all of the information they can to destroy the presidency, and forging an alliance that has even involved the late Senator McCain of Arizona, a Republican, it would not surprise me if they would have access to these sorts of things and try to manipulate the U.S. election towards their own very end. One of the things that I think we're both sensitive to as patriotic Americans is corruption. And, it's really been an eye-opening last 4 or 5 years, directly looking at stuff with the Hunter Biden's corruption, learning more about the extent of Hillary Clinton's corruption and the way that she was working closely with the American media in the 2016 election, of course, with the Donna Brazile scandal, and then with even other things that aren't necessarily related to Trump, with things like Edward Snowden. And I guess you got to say Epstein here is another thing you think of. A lot of people before 2016 did not suspect the U.S. to be as corrupt as we do now. So it's definitely not surprising to me. Thus, I do think it would be potentially very likely that a CIA program, not necessarily being run by the CIA, but potentially being executed by just people who are vaguely affiliated with it. It's something that definitely could happen indeed. Though, these are things that are unproven, and that's one of the more frustrating things. One of the things I felt as they've been looking into election fraud is that we just don't have all the pieces before us, and it even seems like it'll be unlikely that we will get a full auditing of the election in places like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan. So it almost feels like you can have a hunch or a theory about this sort of thing. And even though you might not necessarily have proof of it, there's also nothing being done to make the system more transparent to necessarily disprove the theory.
Yeah, let me just go into a little bit more detail about this Hammer and Scorecard program. So this is from, as I said, Lieutenant General McInerney is his name. He says that Hammer is a counterintelligence surveillance program used to spy on activities on protected networks like voting machines without detection, while Scorecard is a vote manipulation application that changes votes during transfer. It's the least detectable form of election manipulation because it works during data transfer between voting stations and data storage hubs. Unless both sides are looking for irregularities, it's impossible to catch. If nefarious forces had people on one side or the other, or both, during data transfer, it cannot be exposed. He goes on to say, the CIA program known as Scorecard allows its users to change voting outcomes by hacking into the transfer between local reporting stations and state or national data centers. According to McInerney, it's a small amount, under 3%, to keep it from triggering any alarms. He would know. He served in top military positions under the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President of the United States. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on, and I think it will become a lot more popular in the coming days as a possible theory as to why or how the voter fraud happened.
Definitely. I'm actually surprised I had not heard about it earlier, because this is a very compelling line.
Yeah, I will certainly send you the link. Okay, so where should we go next?
We could just wrap it up with something more pleasant and end a little bit earlier than usual this week, if you like.
Okay, sure. So, as Verv said, our final news story is going to be something to end on a positive note. As you know, the media these days has been very negative, and it's very hard not to be depressed or anxious about what's going on in the U.S. and around the world, or here in Korea where we live. I occasionally read a website called the goodnewsnetwork.org, and there was a story that caught my attention, partially because it's connected to abortion. And this is a story about a man with Down syndrome, and he completes the Ironman Challenge. He was the first person with Down syndrome to ever complete the Ironman Challenge. For those of you who don't know, the Ironman Challenge includes swimming, cycling, and running. So a quote from the article says, "This past Saturday, after swimming 2.4 miles, the 21-year-old Floridian cycled 112 miles and then ran a 26.2-mile marathon to become the first competitor with Down syndrome to successfully cross the finish line in the 42-year history of the Ironman race." So the reason why this caught my attention, as I said, was that recently there's been a push in Korea, and of course there's a debate going on in the U.S. with Roe v. Wade about abortion, and those of you who know anything about abortion would know that people with Down syndrome are typically the kind of people that would be aborted. Usually when your wife is pregnant or a woman is pregnant, they do testing. They are able to determine if a child has Down syndrome while it is still in the womb. And a lot of times, especially in places like Korea, you will be encouraged to abort that baby. But, here we have the negative consequences of that would be people like this man, this 21-year-old Floridian with Down syndrome, would not be able to complete this Ironman challenge if he was aborted. People with Down syndrome these days are aborted at alarming rates, and those of you who have ever known anybody with Down syndrome, they are amazing, very joyful people that can certainly give you a whole new outlook on life. So I kind of wanted to just connect that a bit to abortion and, it's a feel-good story that I think all of us can agree on. What do you think about that, Verv?
Yeah, very excellent story. It reminded me of a story that actually is a little bit old, but I only learned about it recently. There was a bodybuilder with Down syndrome that in 2018 went on to compete fairly, successfully overall, who, as an amateur bodybuilder. And it's kind of one of those things where people with all sorts of medical conditions can really end up doing great and wonderful things, and yet people still will even question whether or not they have a right to live. So it's pretty astounding. Especially imagine, the number of regular people who never do anything remotely outstanding with their life and just sit in front of a TV or just, do drugs, get fat, do nothing. There's plenty of people just like that, yet no one would ever think about questioning whether or not they should have aborted them. Yet just because someone has a disability, it's now on the cards for people. It's really a shame.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we will end there. Any final words, Verv, before we sign off?
Have a very pleasant week and a happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yes, that's right. In the U.S. soon, Thanksgiving will be happening. So yes, those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving. Those of you who don't, you can eat turkey too, and perhaps join a friend if you know an American for Thanksgiving. It's a great time, lots of good food. Me and Verv will be spending time together as well for Thanksgiving.
That's right.
Yeah. So if you've made it this far, again, thank you for listening. We appreciate everything, and please give a like to the video, and if you have not, please subscribe. We will see you guys again on the next episode of the Paleoconnection. Thank you very much.